Harold Davis, and I'm a photographer and writer, and it's my great pleasure to present to you about creative flower photography. This morning, as it happens, I was out in my garden photographing flowers and water drops. We've had a little bit of rain this morning, but it died away nicely with a little sun coming out, so it seems like a perfect segue into talking about flowers, which are among my favorite things to photograph.
Okay, let's see. Our first question is, do you photograph flowers in the studio or outdoors?
Oh, that's a great question, because I love to photograph flowers anywhere I find them, which means really there are four different kinds of environments in which I like to photograph flowers. First of all, I do enjoy photographing flowers in the studio because I can completely control the environment and I can use my light box technique for transparency. Then my garden is a place that I like to photograph flowers in. And one of the advantages there is that if I step on something or move around or rearrange a flower, I only answer to myself. You can also do great flower photography in places like public gardens, arboretums, horticultural nurseries, and finally, of course, there's the whole wide world of wildflowers that are out in the wilderness and that are briefly in bloom. So my answer would be both. Thank you for the question. A great question.
Okay, question number 2. What lens do you like to use?
Well, first of all, I come from the place that photographers take photos, not gear. So while a lens is a very important thing, it's kind of like a paintbrush to a painter for a photographer, because it does the angle that you can actually capture the world. You can do all kinds of wonderful photography with very limited gear if you have to. That said, I really do love macro lenses. I have a passion for macro lenses. And one of my very favorite macro lenses is a telephoto macro, a 200 millimeter f4 macro that Nikon makes. And this is a cool lens because you can do things that are close-ups of flowers from very far away and have very compacted sense of perspective and depth while you do it. And that gives you the possibility of creating very interesting views without interposing yourself and your shadow into something. For the very same reason, it's a great lens for photographing small birds like hummingbirds or bees or things like that also. Great question.
Diane asks, when shooting indoors, what equipment do you use? Do you use strobes or continuous, Nikon, Canon?
Well, great question. Two of them there, really. First of all, on the great Nikon to Canon war, I'm a steadfast agnostic. I mean, all fairly sophisticated DSLRs have more equipment and capabilities than any of us really use. As it happens, I shoot Nikon, but that's not, that's not saying that it's got virtues over Canon. I just went back in the film days. I was a Nikon shooter. I didn't think too much when I went to digital, and now now I'm stuck because I've got all the lenses. But that said, I like them both. In terms of lighting, indoors I tend to not use strobes or flashes because there's really no need. Flowers don't move when you have them in the studio, and you can control continuous lighting much better and see what you're doing. Outdoors, sometimes I do use strobes, incidentally, because you've got a flower moving in the wind, and the only way to stop it is to stop motion with a strobe. But in the studio, I tend to use very modest continuous lighting. I've got a couple of continuous tungsten photo lights with reflectors, umbrellas. I've got a light tent and a couple of things like that. But normally, you can really do flowers indoors without very much fancy lighting at all. All you really need is a couple of reflective cards and to make sure you can beam light into areas that might be dark, and you've got it made. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. Okay, let's take one from Paul. Paul says, can you tell us about your light box?
My famous light box. I'm, by the way, for those who don't know it, I'm submitting the web address for my main page. You can go to a gallery of my floral pictures there, and it's not quite as good as having me walk you through it, but at least you'll get some idea of the visuals. And you'll find links there also to my books and to my workshop schedule as well. A lot of my photos, the first photo in the presentation I was going to show you was created by placing flowers on a light box, primarily using backlighting as the source for lighting and shooting straight down on them. If you do this correctly, as you can see a photo of the setup I use in my book, Photographing Flowers, Exploring Macro Worlds with Harold Davis. You can get extremely transparent effect, an effect of apparent transparency combined with saturated, rich colors. Actually, there's nothing terribly special about the setup I use for this. If you go online and search for a light box, you'll find a whole bunch of them, either with a fluorescent tube or with LEDs behind them. I kind of lean these days towards the LED ones. You want something that's roughly speaking daylight balanced, probably. Dick Blick, the art supply store online, has a bunch of different models. The one I use most is an old thing that was used for slide viewing back in the old days, and it's about 5 feet long and 3 feet wide, and that gives me enough space to really do layouts on it. As I say, what I do is I shoot straight down. So to do that, depending upon the size layout I need, I really need to get up fairly high, so I use a little step ladder and a high tripod. Generally with this, you're looking at things that are fairly flat, and you want to get a kind of flat effect. So you do want to use a macro lens because those do flat kinds of field, but you don't necessarily need to stop it down for maximum depth of field because nothing is really sticking out too far. Thank you for asking about it.
Okay. Let's take a peek here. We have a question from Mohammed. Mohammed would like to know, would you prefer full frame for macro photography?
Yes, I probably would. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that most of the work I do is with 1.5 form frame sensors. Obviously, you can get better essentially resolution with a larger sensor size. On the other hand, there is something that happens with using a smaller sensor. Your macro lenses or even your normal lens will get you closer, which is a nice thing too sometimes. So there are trade-offs, and it works both ways. Let me put it this way: sometimes they say that perfection is the enemy of the good. That means that if you spend too much time worrying, do I have the right equipment for this? Am I going to do it right? Instead of just jumping in and trying to do the photography, then you won't come up with neat shots. What another photographer, Jay Mizell, also put it this way: people spend too much time worrying about what a good pixel is and not enough time talking about what a good photo is. So really, I'm much more concerned about what a good photo is. And if you do need to master the craft so that you have something that can be reproduced and printed, but you don't need to go and say, hey, I have to have a full frame image, or even I have to have a macro lens. In point of fact, extension tubes and a close-up lens work very well as a substitute for a macro lens. Thank you for the question, Mohammed.
Thank you, Harold. Let's see here. We have a question from Varun. Varun would like to know, what would you advise a novice photographer like me, who doesn't own any professional equipment, to try to get some decent photos of flowers?
Well, you can take very good photos of flowers with any equipment. There's really no equipment requirement here. Most compact digital cameras have a macro mode. That's fine for taking pictures of flowers. What I would advise you to do, Varuna, is look very closely. The looking and seeing comes before the shooting. So look at the flowers and say, hey, what is it I want to capture about them? Is it a color? Is it a contrast in color? Is it a sense of different flowers growing together? Is it a spiral and arc of the way the stem of the flower fits? So figure out what it is that moves you about the flower, and then position yourself and the camera, whatever camera you have, and I really don't care what it is, in a way to see what you can do to get that sense of elegance or of color or whatever it is, and then go back and look and see what you've done. One of the mistakes that people often make in photography is not to look carefully enough at what they've shot while the memory is still fresh. You want to review it, you want to see it, and you want to learn from it. What do I like about this? Let me do more of it. What do I not like about this? How do I fix it? In some ways, photography of something like flowers is a lot like troubleshooting. You've got to sort of, there are many variables, including some that are out of one's control. What is the light like on a given day? That kind of thing. And what you have to try to do is control the ones you can and work with the ones you can't. Take advantage of chance events, but mostly look at flowers very carefully. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a question coming in from Sarah Fiona. She says, some of your beautiful Lightbox images have flowers arranged so that they are lying across one another. Do you create this composition to shoot, or do you photograph each flower individually, then layer them in PS?
Great question. Mostly I create the compositions in answer. I mean, I'm not beyond layering in PS, Photoshop that is, but mostly I create the compositions and then shoot them. For me, the real question of whether I do something in shooting or in Photoshop is sort of a practical, functional one. Where is it going to be least work, and where is it going to be most fun? I love working in Photoshop, and I love photography, but to take a couple of flowers and layer them together when they're, as Fiona said, overlapping is actually fairly difficult to get right in Photoshop, and it's not all that hard to get right in photography. So I tend to try to get an interesting composition on the Lightbox first. Where there's an exception to that, where I'm shooting a kind of composition that is, for example, to take an example, I've done a bunch of panoramic shots on the Lightbox. Again, one of those is in photographing flowers, and the thing there is that I have to put it together, basically, and it's not a simple matter to put it together. It does involve doing some overlapping layers to get that right. In that case, one of the reasons that I'm shooting a multiple image panorama rather than cropping a single frame is that the requirements for printing these things as potentially large murals is to have a really big file to start with. But otherwise, I would certainly prefer to arrange them. Apart from anything else, it's kind of like it's fun. I love arranging flowers. It's sort of like Japanese floral arrangements, or what you can do to make your living quarters look nicer. And then I'm just doing it on a Lightbox, and I get to capture it and save it. Life is good. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see here. Oh, and folks are sending us notes that they're very much enjoying this Q&A today. So thank you again, Harold. We have Claude. Claude has a comment and a question. Claude says, I find photographic judges at the club level particularly harsh on flower photography because flowers are easy to find as a subject, but not always easy to, photograph in a creative way. Do you find that a particular type of photograph gets more attention than others?
Well, this brings up a whole bunch of different questions. The judging at photo contests is a tricky issue in and of itself. I've been a judge at a couple of photo contests, and I don't find that an easy thing to do. I think it's inherently subjective to some extent. And, you're right about flowers. Anybody can go out and go to probably a local supermarket and find nice flowers to photograph. One of my little secrets is that I do get some of my flowers from Trader Joe's to photograph, and they work fine. You don't have to go to a boutique florist or anything. You can just find, it's not hard. If you can find a bunch of roses for your sweetie, you can find a bunch of roses to photograph. And as I like to joke, you don't need a model release, so you don't have the whole business that you do when photographing people. When you're photographing people, you usually have to get the cooperation of your subject in a complex way, and there's the whole business of interpersonal reaction. So I think there is a sense that flower photography, quote, is easy, although of course it's not really, or that it's cliched. So the two are different things. In terms of the it's easy, I don't think it is. I mean, I think good flower photography is about the same thing that any good photography is really about. That's not journalistic. In other words, okay, so when you're photographing a flower, you're not covering a war and you're not covering human interest stories, but hopefully you are saying something about shape and color and form and emotion. So photographing a flower from that viewpoint is no different than any other kind of photography that says something about shape, form, color, and emotion. It doesn't really matter if it's a flower or a doorway in shadow or any of the shapes and forms that we photographers like to play with. The problem is that it's fairly easy to create a cliched photo of a flower because even a bad photo of a flower is pretty beautiful. So people take these pictures and they say, hey, I've got something here. And, more power to them for trying to make something beautiful, but just because you press the trigger doesn't mean you've got a great photo, and of course that applies as much to me as to anybody else. One of the most important skills that a photographer can have is to be a good self-editor, to understand what it is that's interesting about images, and since we all take photos that are not world-class, it's important to self-edit them so you don't show them to other people. Part of the task of becoming a good self-editor is to look around at the wonderful libraries of photos there are, classical photos and not-so-classical photos. For example, you could look at the work of Andrei Kertész, a great Hungarian and American photographer who did some lovely black and white photos of tulips that are quite famous. And you could look at them and you could say, hey, why are these revered as masterworks? And understanding that will help you see with your own photos, well, I've got something that's interesting, or maybe this is just another flower photo. If I look at one of my own photos and I say, this is just another flower photo, it's sort of like the people who photograph models who are GWCs, guys with cameras. Okay, that's not very interesting. But on the other hand, if you look at it and you say, hey, I have captured this flower in a way nobody else has ever done, and it's interesting. It's got rhythm, it's got lines, it's got symmetry. It may not be classically beautiful, but it is striking. So if you can say that, then you've got something that even judges at any contest are probably going to pay attention to. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, looks like we have somebody who was at your meetup in San Francisco last week, and Jim says, could you please discuss some of the Photoshop techniques that you demonstrated at the San Francisco meetup last week?
That was quite a meetup, wasn't it, Jim? So how many Photoshop techniques did I show and did I discuss? I discussed a lot there. And I discussed a lot at a high level, and I didn't show specific techniques to drill down very much. I think that the three areas that I really worked on, and I should say before I start here that without visuals, I'm not going to be able to do a whole lot better here. The three or four areas that I really focused on were multiple raw processing, creating HDR images that are attractive and not disgusting looking. No offense to anybody who likes over-the-top HDR. I also talked about doing monochromatic conversions, which is a big deal for me. And I also talked about the use of LAB color. So those were the four areas that I touched on. Jim, I'm going to recommend my books, The Photoshop Darkroom #1. I'm also going to recommend Photographing Flowers. because there's a fair amount of all these topics in each of these books, particularly the Photoshop Darkroom book. For multi-raw processing, the key point there is that a raw file is a potential image. It's not an actual image until it is rendered. The rendering of that image is under one's control using tools such as Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom or Nikon Capture or Aperture. You have a great deal of latitude of exposure and color when you do this rendering. And the really exciting thing is you're not limited to one processing through these tools. You can multi-process your images. The theme that runs through all my work, all my post-production work, is that if you make extensive use of layers and masking, you aren't limited to processing an entire image in any one way, no matter where you started from. So almost always I find that I create fairly complex masks that let part of an effect go into an image but hide other parts of the effect. Getting back to multiple raw processing, what you might do in a simple example is you might use it to make the bottom of an image light and the top of an image dark using something like a gradient tool. Or you might paint in areas of a flower. So I said I was out in the garden this morning photographing water drops on a little white flower. Well, I didn't say the little white flower part, but it was there. So there were starbursts of sun from the water drops up toward the top of the flower, but down towards the bottom, the whole thing was in deep shadow. I knew that I couldn't, since there was a little bit of wind, to get exposures long enough to capture this took a bit of patience, and I knew that I was not going to be able to create multiple images to paste together. But what I also knew is that I could expose for the top part of this image, and then I could take it into post-production and lighten up the bottom and mask it into the top. So that's the concept behind multiple raw processing. And I'm not going to bore everyone to tears with LAB color, which is sort of hard to talk about abstractly without looking at it. But let me just say that LAB color is a theoretic color model that has a wider gamut, which means it is more color than any other color model. And it also separates out the luminosity information from the color information, which is very useful in terms of ability to manipulate both luminosity and color. Furthermore, the color channels in it are what are called color opponent. That means that they go from one end of the scale, from magenta to green and from yellow to blue all the way. And so you can shift these around pretty easily using simple Photoshop adjustments. And so here you go. You've shifted the color, and visualize this. The underlying forms of the thing are the same. They haven't changed. So here you go, and you have a different color that you've created in a very simple way. You can paint it in on top of the old color, and then you can use Photoshop's wonderful palette of blending modes to determine how the new color blends with the original color. If you don't overuse this gives you a wild array of possibilities of what you can do with your imagery. I have an example shot that was in my slideshow of the core of a poppy with the seeds sticking out of it. And what I did there was I originally shot that poppy with gelled flashes to create colors on the petals. But then I took it into Photoshop and I used these LAB color effects to exaggerate the color so it really looks like a Ferris wheel or something like that with all these colored ends sticking out of it. Anyhow, thank you for the question, and hopefully we'll have a forum where I can present this kind of material along with some visuals so it makes sense. I will note that we have with O'Reilly, a Creative Photoshop Tips for Photographers talk planned on April 6th, if I'm not mistaken.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, folks, again, to see all of Harold's upcoming webcasts with O'Reilly Media, please visit O'Reilly.com/webcasts, and you can find them all there. Let's see here. Joel asks, Harold, what is your favorite type of flower to photograph?
Oh, my favorite type of flower. Oh, there's so many beautiful ones. You know, it's like this. It's my favorite photo is the one I'm going to take tomorrow, or maybe the one I took yesterday. And, you know, which of my kids do I love most? Well, you know, I have 4 kids, incidentally. It turns out I love them all, but I love them all in different ways. You know, it's so hard to say, but I really think I love photographing poppies. Poppies are really interesting because they're so transparent and so colorful and so ephemeral. They are well categorized as a whimsical flower. When they reproduce by seed, you never know where they're going to prop up. And pretty much, if you're going to photograph poppies, you have to grow them. You're never going to get them out of a store in the kind and space that you want to photograph. So poppies are great. But let me just mention, it's hard not to love roses, dahlias, echinaceas, hellebores, orchids. What can I say? You know, unlike one's other relationships in life, when it comes to which flowers you love to photograph, you can be as promiscuous as you want. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Cliff asks, do you know a good company to buy a light box from?
Yeah, I'd recommend Dick Blick Online, probably.
Great, thank you.
Dick Blick's the big art supply company, and what I found is that for a reasonable assortment at reasonable prices, they're probably the best bet.
Perfect, thank you. April asks, do you do any pinhole photography?
Hi, April. I wouldn't put it past me, but, you know, I haven't done a whole lot at this point. One thing I've experimented with is the Lens Baby has a pinhole adapter, so I've done a bit of shooting with that and enjoyed it, but I'm not a huge pinhole person at this point. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Let's see here. We have Gail asks, on a light box, can you use anything to hold the flowers up off the box or just arrange them on the surface?
Well, great question. A lot of the time I just arrange them on the surface. It's also the case that, you know, a flower that's attached still to a branch, like a cherry branch or many other kinds of things, have some natural things that keep them up from the light box surface. You can also use museum gel, which is sort of a clear paste to help hold things up. Note that sometimes I moisten the flowers on the light box to both improve colors and transparency. You know, I'm not above just sort of jerry-rigging something, whoever Jerry was. What you can also think about is that if you do use something to hold a flower up, if it's going to show in your photo, you want to be careful to pick something that's going to be easy to get rid of in post-production. But I would recommend clear museum gel as something that helps with this kind of arrangement. Thanks.
Thank you. Deborah asks, when do you use maximum depth of field or when shallow on flowers?
Well, that's a great question. Let me back up for a second here and explain what depth of field is, first of all. Because depth of field is one of the great creative tools that photographers have, so you really need to understand and master it. Depth of field is the backwards and forwards amount of a plane that is in focus. The main control over that is what you set your aperture to, or f-stop. The bigger the f number, like f36, the smaller the opening in the camera. The smaller the opening in the camera, the more depth of field you have. Problem, if you have a small opening in the camera, you need a faster shutter speed to let enough light in to make your exposure, which is an issue with subjects that move like flowers in the wind. Sometimes you really have no control over how much depth of field you have because field conditions mandate them. I am always aware of what kind of depth of field I'm working with, and what I choose has to do with what effect I want. A flower in the wind where that flower is in focus and behind that flower is a lovely field of blurred colors using what's called bokeh, nice out-of-focus effects, is a beautiful thing. On the other hand, sometimes you want to get your entire flower in focus and sharp, because that also can be a beautiful thing. Some people are truly masterful at low depth of field, highly selective images. Others prefer images that are more like botanical illustrations that have high depth of field. You can't say one's right or the other's wrong, but if you're going to photograph flowers, you ought to begin to become aware of it as a key creative tool. Also note that a related topic of how you get an image to look tack sharp, the positioning of your camera in relation to what you're photographing turns out to be extremely important in something like flowers, because you want the plane of the sensor to be as parallel as possible to your subject. If that is the case, if you've managed to position things so that the plane of your camera, which think of it as sort of the back of the camera, if you will, is parallel completely to your subject, you don't need much depth of field to make it really sharp. So a good question and a big topic, and one to work with as a photographer until you truly understand depth of field and what it does to the options and the way your image is going to look. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Harold. Looks like we have just 2 questions remaining. Edwina asks, are all flower photos to be counted as natural shot? What about the ones taken in indoor light as well?
Hi, Edwina. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I would always rather be an image maker than somebody who categorizes images. I don't know. I mean, I think you raise a good point. In many ways, many flower photographs are artificial, even when they're shot outdoors, incidentally. I mean, you know, if you're out there outdoors and you're using a tool like a clamp or a McClamp to hold your flower in place, these are specialized kinds of clamps that can be used in the field to prevent the flower from moving around, and you've got macro strobes aimed at the flower and a reflector, and you've said, hey, that background doesn't look any good, so you moved in a new background. Hey, in what sense isn't that an artificial image? You know, I come at this really from another viewpoint. And my point of view is what I care about, and for that matter, how I make my living, and what moves me is a final image. And I don't worry so much about how I got there. I mean, I'm prepared to use tricks. Anybody who knows me and what I do knows that I can be pretty tricky. But it's sort of the integrity of the final result that matters. There's no right or wrong technique for getting there. It's not when you're photographing flowers, it's not a situation like journalism where if you fake something, you've done a crime. You haven't. Unless you're doing a flower catalog for a horticultural nursery and everything needs to be exactly as it's going to look in real life, that's a different situation. But if you're doing flowers for art, well, there's no right and there's no wrong. But if you ask me the question of do I feel that when I shoot flowers in a studio, essentially I'm doing a kind of still life photography, you know, and it could as well be glassware or something, except that maybe flowers are prettier. Well, absolutely. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Harold. And our last one comes from Bob, and Bob says, oh, sad that we couldn't see the presentation today, but he's very much enjoying the Q&A and asks, where can we see more of your flower photography?
Hey, thank you so much for the pitch. I love very much that you've asked me. I entered the address for my website in the chat box. I hope it came through. It's photoblog2.com or digitalfieldguide.com. If you go there, I have a blog with thousands of entries, and many of them are categorized by flowers. You'll find a lot of flower photography there. You'll also find a gallery of my flower photos up there. And I do have a new book out that I'm very, very excited about. It's called Photographing Flowers, Exploring Macro Worlds with Harold Davis, and you can find it, as they say, on Amazon and other fine booksellers. And I don't think my flower images are that hard to find, but please please go look at them, and I'd love to hear what anyone has to say about them afterwards. Thanks, though.